Girl Scouts. My name is Sharon. I'm a STEM program specialist with Girl Scouts of Central Texas, and it is STEM Week this week, so I want to talk to you about one of my favorite hobbies, baking. I'm going to show y'all an experiment that you can do at home to learn how yeast works. When we bake, sometimes we use different kinds of leavening agents. Those are something that makes our tasty treats puff up instead of staying flat. If you look in your kitchen cabinets, you might find baking powder, baking soda, or yeast. These are all things we can use to make our baked goods rise. Most breads use something called yeast to rise. Yeast is actually a fungus, like a mushroom, but mushrooms are made of lots of different cells, and yeast is actually only one cell, which is why it's so tiny. But how does yeast make bread rise? Let's find out. Here is a simple science experiment you can try to see yeast in action in your own home. You're going to need 3 resealable bags, some water, some yeast, sugar, a marker to label your bags, some measuring spoons, bowls, oven mitts, things like that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put a half a teaspoon of yeast into each of these Ziploc bags. To each of those bags, we're going to add a half a teaspoon of sugar. And then we're going to add the water to each of the bags. So I am going to start with my room temperature water. And for each of these, we're just going to add 2 tablespoons of water. And then we are going to very carefully seal the bag and try and get as much air out of the bag as possible. And then we are going to take our cold water, we don't want any ice, we just want water. And we're going to add 2 tablespoons of cold water to our cold bag. This has our hot water, which I heated up in the microwave for like 2.5 minutes. I'm going to take 2 tablespoons of the hot water and very carefully put it into our last bag. Now, I want you to make a prediction about what you think is going to happen with each of those bags, and then we are going to wait for an hour to an hour and a half to see what happens with our science experiment. So it's been a little bit over an hour. If you're doing this at home, you want to give your bags about an hour to an hour and a half before you come back and observe your experiment. So what happens? Which bag inflated the most? The yeast in the bag that inflated the most were the most active, and whichever bag is flattest, the yeast in that bag were least active. So why did this happen? Yeast really like to eat sugar, and when they eat all of that sugar, it makes them a little bit gassy, and they burp out carbon dioxide. If it does that inside your bread, the carbon dioxide gets trapped and makes the bread grow or rise. Our bags helped us simulate the gas getting trapped, so you can see that in my version of the experiment, the yeast in the hot water was most active, the yeast in the room temperature water was somewhat active, and the yeast in the cold water hardly did anything. That's because yeast is active at about room temperature and works more quickly at warmer temperatures. But if you weren't careful, you might have had your hot water yeast not do anything. If the water was too hot, the yeast will actually die, and then they can't produce any gas. Yeast still works in cold water, but it's much, much slower. So if you were making bread with cold water, you would have to let your bread rise for a very long time, or it wouldn't rise at all. So that's why most recipes have you use warm water, so it'll activate your yeast and you won't have to make it rise forever. As I mentioned earlier, yeast is just one way that we can make our baked goods rise. You might want to find out more about how baking powder and baking soda work to make cakes and brownies rise. You might also be able to think of other ways that we make our snacks rise in the kitchen. If you think the science of cooking and baking is cool, you might want to explore careers as a food scientist, a baker, a chef, or a nutritionist. Or you might just want to continue experimenting with food science from the comfort of your own kitchen every time you cook at home. I hope you had fun and learned something new today. See you next time!